All right, I wanted to take a look at Psalm 91, basically because I had heard a presentation on it, a podcast. It's called the Naked Bible Podcast. If you want the nitty gritty of this particular psalm and the Hebrew words behind it, you can find that on your podcast or whatever. It's called the Naked Bible Podcast. But the interesting thing about this psalm is, well, let's just jump right into it. Psalm 91 is very familiar, I hope, to many people. It has some really great and assuring lines in it. You who live in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty, will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, or the arrow that flies by day, or the pestilence that stalks in darkness, or the destruction that wastes at noonday. Some of the words in here, the way it's translated, we can't really see what people at the time would have seen. This word for pestilence, it looks like the regular Hebrew word for a meaning word or thing, but it actually is also, along with keteb, the name of deities or Canaanite deities. Deber, for instance, yes, it's a homonym for word or thing. If you don't know much about Hebrew, it's a language where it uses three-letter roots, just three letters. That makes the root for pretty much all the nouns, all the words. So you have quite a few situations where you have the same three letters. They look like identical roots, but they're entirely different words. So if you have an older translation or something like the King James Version, it might say a deadly word rather than pestilence, which is what it also means. It is used 4 times to refer to a personified deity, and it often appears with sword and famine. These are the classic 3 things in the Old Testament in terms of things that can go wrong that often do. If you think to the punishments or the judgments that David was given an option for after he took a census of the people of Israel. He realized he'd made a mistake. And the prophet came to him and said, well, you have to choose what's going to happen. Are you going to have 4 months of your enemies going after you, a famine, or a plague? So that's where we often see these 3 occurring together. Keteb, at least in one text, it appears in slightly different form, but that's just because it's Ugaritic and not Hebrew. It appears to be a kinsman of Mot, the god of death, so not good. And if we look at Hosea 13:14, we can see them again. Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your plagues? That's Deber again. O Sheol, where is your destruction? That's Keteb. And that might sound familiar because this is the passage that Paul quotes in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians when he's talking about the resurrection. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? As we can look at these 2 words here, these aren't just words for pestilence. They were also associated with spiritual powers or spiritual beings, and the Canaanites associated them with particular deities. And there's also another term here, that the arrow that flies by day. It seems a little bit mysterious. Why would we suddenly be talking about arrows? Well, that word for arrows are important because of another figure that is also a Canaanite deity. And if we look at Deuteronomy 32, 23 to 24, God is talking about what's going to happen in the future to the people of Israel when they become disobedient. I will heap disasters upon them. I will spend my arrows against them, wasting hunger, burning consumption, bitter pestilence. And that word there is resheph. The teeth of beasts I will send against them, the venom of things crawling in the dust. Also in Habakkuk chapter 3, 3 to 5, we have another vision of God coming from Taman. That would be the area where the holy mountain of God was. God came from Taman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. The brightness was like the sun. Rays came forth from his hand where his power lay hidden. Before him went pestilence, there's the bear again, and plague followed close behind, Resheph. There they're more clearly names, but they are not independent deities. That's the statement that's being made theologically by the prophets and also in the psalm, is that the pagans are wrong. These are not independent powers. They are totally under the control of the God of Israel, who is absolutely sovereign. Okay, that should be, Resheph is a Canaanite deity depicted as an archer. That's where the arrows come in. Whenever Resheph appears or is described, he's an archer who shoots arrows. So when we think about why the word archer might be in some of these scriptures, or at least the arrows, that's because it's referring to this, at least in the background of their thinking, this deity of Canaan. In Psalm 78:48, it's describing the plagues of Egypt and God's victory over the gods of Egypt. He gave over their cattle to the hail and their flocks to thunderbolts. That's to the Reshefs. And there they're translating it as arrows or thunderbolts. Job 5-7 describes human beings are born to trouble just as sparks fly upward. It's a really weird line, and I always wondered, it never made sense to me when I read it, but it really means, and the sons of Resheph fly upwards. You're not just born, but then there's all this trouble that the world throws at you in addition to it. Let's go back to the psalm. So here we have again the arrow that flies by day. That's a reference to Resheph. And what we're really looking at in this psalm is a reference to what are considered to be destructive or evil powers of chaos that are out to get us. Here, this is taken from an article. You can see it's Jesus and Psalm 91 in the light of the exorcism scrolls. It was written by Craig A. Evans. And he writes, Satan's appeal to Psalm 91 no longer occasions surprise. Commentators have long suspected that this psalm was understood as offering assurance against demonic affliction. This is seen in rabbinic interpretation and in the Targum paraphrase. Nevertheless, some interpreters have expressed reservations, arguing that the rabbinic and Targumic traditions are too late to be of use in New Testament interpretation. However, the discovery at Qumran, that is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So they're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The discovery at Qumran of Psalm 91 in combination with exorcism psalms has pretty well settled the matter once and for all. Psalm 91 apparently was understood in the time of Jesus as offering divine assurance of protection against demonic powers. It's actually what this psalm is about. It's not really about protection against plagues, although it is that as well. It's about protection against powers of darkness, demonic forces. In this discovery at Qumran, what they found was a text that indicated that there were 4 exorcism psalms that David had written, or at least it claimed there were. The first 3 nobody had ever heard of, and they're in fragmentary form, but the 4th one was actually Psalm 91. I found this curious because I'd always wondered what it was that David had sung to Saul. You remember Saul had a spirit that would come and oppress him, and he would have David come and play the lyre for him. And then apparently David would stop and Saul would pick up his spear and chuck it at David. But I always wondered if any of the Psalms that had come down to us were perhaps one of the ones he had actually sung to King Saul in his distress. Here's a few verses forward looking into Psalm 91 a little further. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only look with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked, because you have made the Lord your refuge, the Most High your dwelling place. No evil shall befall you, no scourge come near your tent. If you've noticed, this is the second time that, or here's the Psalms referring to God as Most High, or El Elyon. That's stressing the fact that God is God over all other beings in the universe, either in the heavens or on the earth. And that would make sense in the context of other beings that might be out there lurking in the shadows. And we wonder, well, how can that be? We're used to pictures of angels with wings or something from Milton's Paradise Lost, and we wonder how can actually some of the heavenly beings not be fully trusted. Job 4:18 says, even in his servants he puts no trust, and his angels he charges with error. So the heavenly beings are not actually incorruptible, and we sort of know that already from events in Genesis. Here is the Targum. It's an expansion that was put together in final form probably around the 4th century AD, but some of the material will go back even earlier to Jesus's time. And you can see how they very clearly thought of Psalm 91 as a promise of protection against demonic power. You will not be afraid of the terror of the demons that go about in the night, nor of the arrow of the angel of death that he shoots in the daytime, nor of the death that goes about in the darkness, nor of the company of demons that destroy at noon. You will call to remembrance the holy name, and 1,000 will fall at your left side and 10,000 at your right hand, but they will not come near you to do you harm. You will only look with your eyes, and you will see how the wicked are being destroyed. Solomon answered. It's interesting, they imagine that this psalm is written from David to Solomon, as though David is instructing Solomon in what to do. Solomon answered, and this is what he said: because you, O Lord, are my refuge, and the most high dwelling place, you have set the house of your Shekinah. That's the glory of the Lord, the bright light that fills the temple. The Lord of the world responded, and this is what he said: no evil shall befall you, and no plague or demons shall come near your tent. Okay. And if anyone has any questions, remember, I do have you muted. You can put a comment in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself, and then I'll be able to hear you. Let's go on a little bit. And then according to Josephus, who was around at the time of Masada and the destruction of Jerusalem, exorcists in his time made use of spells, incantations, and even a special ring thought to derive from Israel's famous monarch, that would be Solomon. Amulets and magical papyri from later times attest the popularity of Solomon and his ring. But there, of course, are familiar incidents from the book of Acts. This is, I think, my favorite one of all. I think it's supposed to be intentionally humorous. These poor fellows thinking that they were going to be able to cast out demons. In Acts 19, beginning in verse 13. Then some itinerant Jewish exorcists tried to use the name of the Lord Jesus over those who had evil spirits, saying, I adjure you by the Jesus whom Paul proclaims. 7 sons of a Jewish high priest named Sceva were doing this. But the evil spirit said to them in reply, Jesus I know, and Paul I know, but who are you? Then the man with the evil spirit leaped on them, mastered them all, and so overpowered them that they fled out of the house naked and wounded. When this became known to all residents of Ephesus, both Jews and Greeks, everyone was awestruck, and the name of the Lord was praised. Also, many of those who became believers confessed and disclosed their practices. A number of those who practiced magic collected their books and burned them publicly. When the value of these books was calculated, it was found to come to 50,000 silver coins. So the word of the Lord grew mightily and prevailed. Now, let's move on a little bit more. Let's look a little bit further in Psalm 91. This is where we can recognize it. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. This is the one that Satan quotes during the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. And we can see in Matthew chapter 4, verses 6 to 7, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hand they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. It's interesting that the devil does not include verse 13. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent, you will trample underfoot. Those are pretty clear references. James in 1 Peter describes Satan as a voracious, prowling lion. Our enemy, the devil, is a voracious, prowling lion. Also, serpent, that's a fairly clear allusion to the enemies of God's plan, the enemy from the garden. And we can see even other examples here. That word for serpent is just tanin, but we can find that in other places. In Isaiah 27:1, describing the final day of judgment. On that day, the Lord, with his cruel and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, tanin, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. There's not only the figure of the serpent, but also the figure of the dragon, which is picked up again in the book of Revelation by the Apostle John. This is an image for the forces of darkness, the enemies of God, everything that seeks to undermine and derail God's plan and cause pain and suffering for human beings. Here's the young lion. Psalm 58:1 says, do you indeed decree what is right, you gods? This is where we hear God talking to the heavenly assembly. Do you judge people fairly? O God, break the teeth in their mouths, tear out the fangs of the young lions. So the idea of defanging the lions is that you'll have victory over these forces. There's also another passage that if you get an older Bible, it may not say this because it was changed in the Masoretic text. But looking at the Greek text of the Septuagint and also from the text recovered at Qumran or from the Dead Sea Scrolls, this text actually reads, when the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods. The division of humankind, of course, is when the tongues were confused at Babel. Here we're having the Babylon image come in again. Whenever you see Babylon in the Bible, it pretty much symbolizes the forces arrayed against God who have risen in rebellion against God's plan, the forces of chaos, the forces of evil, the forces of death. And we have this belief also reflected in Paul. So even though the nations were sort of given over to these other beings, the Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. He took Abraham and called him out and created a people of his own. And Paul on Mars Hill, we had this in church just not long ago at all, a couple of weeks. From one ancestor, he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. So Paul has this running in his head too. This is the way he imagined what's happening in the spiritual realm, that the nations were governed, presided over, influenced by heavenly beings who were not gods, and that God's intention in doing that is to have many different peoples in many different places so that they might reach out and perhaps find God in the truth. Paul also alludes to this in 1 Corinthians 10:19, where he says, what do I imply then? That food sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. That would take a little while to unpack, but isn't it interesting how he does say an idol's not important. You get the anonymous bits of meat in the marketplace. That's fine. Go ahead and eat it. But don't let anyone see you in any way eating in such a way that you appear to be participating in a sacrifice or sharing a table of fellowship with the people who are making the sacrifice, because he does not want us to be partners with demons. That was what they thought ultimately was behind the divinities of the other nations. Let's take another look at this. This Psalm 82 is pretty clear about what's happening in the divine council. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the Elohim, he holds judgment. I want to stop there just for a minute, because we just don't have a word for that. An Elohim is just, it refers to where somebody is. So that an Elohim is something that is a spiritual being. It belongs in heaven. And God is spirit, so God is in heaven, but God is not like any of the others. God is absolutely unique. That's the point trying to be made by Psalm 91, that he is utterly in charge. None are like him. He created all other beings and is himself uncreated. We just don't have a word like that, except maybe angels. But that's really also a job description. The word really just means messenger. So an angel could be any kind of heavenly being, but it's just one that's given a message to take to somebody. So this is what God asks. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are God's, children of the Most High. There's El Elyon again. All of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. When I read this and I contrast it with the other psalm where we had the names of Canaanite deities who would refer to things like pestilence or famine, the Old Testament makes it clear that on occasion God does use these things. God can use the weather, but God doesn't always maintain or isn't behind every single thing that happens. If you take Elijah's prayer for rain, he deliberately prays for rain. He looks, he sees on the horizon a cloud about the size of his fists. I guess he stretches it out and looks. So that's God bringing rain in response to his prayer. On the other hand, when Joseph gets his dream about the famine that's coming to Egypt, there's no sense that God is doing it on purpose. It's just sometimes you get lean years and some are coming. I'm telling you ahead of time so you can get ready for it. But God is the one that is in control of all these things. There's not a whole bunch of other minor deities behind them. That's the whole point of Psalm 91. And of course, today we recognize with things like pestilence that they could be caused by viruses, they could be caused by parasites and different infectious agents. But we also are no different than they. For me, the definition of an act of God is something where you look at it and you can't find any other cause except that God did it. And for them, of course, they didn't know that there were such things as germs, and people would just mysteriously fall ill, and they interpreted that as being some sort of a direct action by God. The reason I went through all that is I want to point out that here in Psalm 82, where those names are not being used almost metaphorically to make a theological point, where God is directly talking to the council, we see that the complaint is not that they've been sending plagues. They don't have that power. They're not in control. It's that they've been influencing people to do wicked things. They've been influencing human beings to not judge justly, to show partiality to the wicked, to fail to give justice to the weak and the orphan, and to not maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. That's their principal and primary influence and the thing that they're being held responsible for. And when I see that too, it makes me think of that frustrating episode where Jesus came back from the Mount of Transfiguration, and he finds that his disciples were unable to heal a boy that gets thrown down on the ground, and he shakes. And it's interesting that we get enough detail to suspect that that looks an awful lot like epilepsy, not what we would think of as a demonic oppression or something like that, but as a medical condition. And that's where Jesus says this kind only comes out by prayer, and maybe prayer and fasting, depending on which gospel you're looking at. But that again goes with Psalm 91. God is in control of all that. So for a cure or a healing, you would have to have a prayer, because only the Father can pull something like that off. If you think of the resurrection of Lazarus, Jesus does say, Lazarus, come forth. But before he says that, he says, Father, I know you always hear me. In other words, he's doing it by prayer too. All the natural world is not in the hands of any of these forces. They're totally in God's hands, and that's reassuring. God is in control of everything, and none of these dark forces, whatever influence they don't have it anymore. And see, that's what it is. They judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked. Here we'll get back to the temptation of Jesus, where it says, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. It's written, he'll command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, again it is written, do not put your Lord your God to the test. It's curious why Satan would actually quote from the psalm that indicates that the Lord will give you deliverance over the powers of darkness. And here he is saying, well, throw yourself down. Is he just hoping, well, we'll see if it happens? And I was listening to an interpretation, and they said, well, this was just Satan trying his luck. If he does it, maybe they will come and they'll catch him and whatever. Nothing lost. But if they don't catch him, maybe that'll be it, and we'll be done with him. We won't have to worry about the Holy One of God anymore. But if that had happened, then God would have raised him up, and it would have shown God's hand what the plan was. If they'd known that God was just going to raise him up, maybe they never would have sent him to the cross. But I think if we look at it a little bit more fully, we can see that that's not exactly what's going on. Those who love me, I will deliver. I will protect those who know my name. When they call to me, I will answer them. I will be with them in trouble. I will rescue them and honor them. With long life, I will satisfy them and show them my salvation. In the letter to the Hebrews, it describes the prayer of Jesus where he prayed for God to save him. And it seems clearly a reference to the Garden of Gethsemane. And it says his prayer was heard. Well, it sure didn't look like that on Friday, Good Friday. And it didn't look like that on Holy Saturday. It only looked like that on the day of the resurrection. But this was the deliverance that God would work in God's time, in God's own way. So, and in terms of why do these sorts of things happen, where do viruses come from? I really don't know how they get started or why they propagate. But of course, this familiar passage from Luke 13:1 makes a very basic point. At that very time, there were some present who told them about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Probably during Passover. It's about the only time when a regular person would actually be slaughtering the animals for the sacrifice. All the others were done by the priests. He asked them, do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, they were worse sinners than all the other Galileans? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish as they did. Or those 18 who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them? Do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish just as they did. This is similar to a point I was making just this Sunday, that we tend to imagine things in terms of safety, and Jesus is trying to point out, eventually this is going to happen to everyone in one way or another. And what you really have to make sure is that you avoid the death of the spirit, that you find the life that God has for you and not just worry about trying to preserve this life so much. Not that it isn't important, but that they should look at the inner person and not the outer person. They should judge according to the truth and not according to appearances. Or as God judges, by looking at the heart, the contents of the heart. Okay. I am going to go ahead and all right, I'm unmuting everybody, I hope. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Or comments? No questions or comments?
I wrote a lot down that I'm gonna have to look at first.
Okay,